Yeah. So I want to welcome everyone to the technical roadmap session. We're going to be using the webinar mode. So there are some slightly different things to a normal Zoom call, like we'd have normally in the IIIF community calls. Because there are so many people, we're going to keep everyone muted due to the audience size. If you have questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A form at the bottom. We've done a slight change this time, and you're allowed to see questions people have answered, and you can upvote the ones that you're interested in. We've got the IIIF Slack link there, and I'll put it in the chat after I finish speaking. We had a few issues at the start of this week, but I'm pleased to say this is back working now. So if you use that link to join Slack. And this presentation will be recorded, and we'll be sending out the links to the recordings next week. So with that, I'll stop sharing and pass it over to the others.
Okay, does that show slides? Great. Well, greetings everyone. My name's Simeon Warner from Cornell University, and I get to kick off a series of updates and discussions. I perhaps get the easy part because I get to talk for a couple of minutes about recent progress, and I'd like to start off with some fanfare. As of about an hour ago, the IIIF image and presentation APIs version 3 are now live as the current versions of these specifications. This represents an enormous amount of work by a very large number of people. The work toward the version 3 specifications, which notably include support for audio and video, started in earnest in 2016. That's more than 4 years ago, with help from a grant that the British Library had. And the process wrapped up with our technical review committee vote, which was concluded after a 2-week voting period yesterday with, it actually says 32 votes in favor there. I think actually only 30 of those were members of the technical review committee. But anyway, a unanimous approval of the move to release the version 3 specification. So it's a little bit sad that we don't have a sort of in-person forum to have a bit of hooting and hollering and general celebration, but I did my best to make this slide as bright as possible. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes talking about what these, whoops, no, we're going to go to a poll. Now I need Glenn's help. What do we do, Glenn? The question is, have you implemented version 3 of the IIIF specs in any way, either the image or the presentation or both together?
So we've got a number of these polls sprinkled through the presentation, and I've just launched this one now. So it should pop up on your screen, and if you can answer, and then we'll review the results on a slide later on.
So I guess I can continue, right? That's window stays up, Glenn?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I click somewhere else. Okay, so talk for a minute about the changes in the image API, and you'll find that along with the new version of the specification, there is a fairly detailed changelog, which has much more than I'm going to talk about now. So this is an update from the previous release, which was the 2.1.1, some minor changes after 2.1, which was released in 2017. I'll note that this is 3.0, not 2.2, because there are breaking changes. However, the specifications and tools allow version 2 and version 3 image API resources to be used together. So although you can't use a version 2 image API resource with a version 3 against the version 3 specification, you can still keep using version 2 images in, say, a version 3 presentation API manifest. So there are a few sort of major changes which go throughout the specification. There are updates to use the newer version of the JSON-LD specification, version 1.1. There are a number of changes about the keys used in the JSON. So for example, we use ID and type without the @ sign in front, which is much nicer for JavaScript developers. And I think one of the things that goes throughout the specification is there's a much cleaner separation from presentation features. There had previously been things like logo and attribution, which are better put in the presentation API. We have, however, retained the notion of rights, which replaces the previous license, but is now limited to a rights URI. So that's a very actionable thing and is useful in the case that an image API resource is presented without being included in a presentation API manifest. So other key changes. This one's going to be one that's hard for me to get used to. I'm so used to writing full/full 0 default JPEG to get the image, and now one writes full max 0 default to get something that's the full region, maximum size, but not upscaled, unrotated default image. This deprecation was announced as part of 2.1.1. And just in case Max scares you a little bit, I'll note that we've clarified around the idea that Max will not give you an upscaled image unless you write caret max. So that's another part of the change. There's a change in the canonical format of size to be width, comma, height, as opposed to just width, comma. This avoids inconsistencies with possible different calculations of what the height might be for a particular width. The profile has now been somewhat streamlined so that it's a single compliance level, not a combination of a compliance level plus optional compliances. Those have been moved into the extra feature property, which lists things that are supported beyond the particular compliance level, level 0, level 1, level 2. The label now follows the language map pattern for consistent internationalization that is used throughout the presentation API. And we've added extra qualities and extra formats and a registry mechanism for extensions. The IIIF presentation API is also updated in lockstep. This is sort of an accident of history and a connection with things like the changes in JSON 1.1. I don't think future updates to the presentation API and image API will need to go in lockstep, but the same applies here. It's 3.0, not 2.2, because there are breaking changes. The most monumental change here is the addition of duration to the canvas and the support for audio and video. It's been said before, but I'll say it again. There are no IIIF AV APIs because we didn't need to do that. Current web formats provide everything that's needed to include audio and video in a manifest and to paint them onto a canvas without having to have special APIs like we do for images. There's a change from the Open Annotations specification to the now standard W3C web annotations. Similar updates to use JSON LD 1.1 to refine the use of ID and type and things without the @ sign. And as I mentioned before, the consistent use of language maps so that all strings presented to users can be internationalized. There really are quite a few changes to the presentation API, including a number of structural changes. Got here on the left, the sort of organizational picture of different entities in the 2.1, 2.11 presentation API, and then on the right, the 3.0 structure. There's been a lot of work gone into the presentation API to define semantics more clearly, to arrange for much more consistent JSON patterns, which hopefully makes it easier to generate and to consume manifests. There are some pretty big changes, like the notion of a sequence has been replaced by ranges. A lot of issues around dealing with time-based media as opposed to just images. So for example, the notion of expressing the full extent of a range so that you can jump around at sensible points within a time duration. There's been addition of quite a lot of user experience features, such as behaviors to do both with presentation of image content and for time-based media, such as these things should follow on in time sequence, something should repeat or play to the end, and a mechanism again for allowing extensions. Along with these things, there's a set of definitions of what client processing behaviors are expected, which wasn't present in the previous versions. So hopefully one gets a more consistent user experience between different implementations. As I said, there's a lot more detail. I'm just providing a couple of words to get us started here. Some results, Glenn, perhaps.
So hopefully you should all see that. So it was about, I think 68 people answered, 25 people said yes, they've started implementing version 3, and 78 no. So they're the results.
Mike, do you want to share your screen, or do you want to say next slide to me? Oh, except it's not Mike yet. Sorry, the poll got me confused. Sorry. So along with the work on the image APIs, we realized that the complexity of the specification and all the new features meant that we had a choice to make between either starting to include a lot more examples in the specification or separating them out. We took the choice to separate out examples and try and expand the scope a bit into a set of cookbooks. So there's a new process around this, a new set of cookbook editors, and a process separate from updating the specification. So hopefully this will be a useful and evolving set of recipes and examples that can be developed separately. So there's one example live, a number ready for review, and still more in various other stages of process. I'll note that this community is open to additional participation, and there are regular meetings to help people get up to speed. So if you want to get into working with the specifications in detail and really understand them, this might be a wonderful way to both do that and contribute to the community. There's also quite a bit of supporting infrastructure around the new APIs. Thanks mostly to Glenn. There's been a lot of work around supporting the validators for the image and presentation APIs. Connected with the cookbook work, there are a number of fixtures which can be used both in recipes and for other tests. There's infrastructure around building the cookbook entries, and there's a reference implementation of the image API provided on IIIFC infrastructure, which both supports the cookbooks and will presumably be useful for other people developing clients. So, another poll, I think. Have we persuaded you that it might be good to contribute to the cookbook? So, now I
mean, if you could drive, that would be great.
Okay, thanks. Just say next.
All right. So the Discovery Technical Specification Group is working on 2 specifications at the moment. I've included a bit of overview here just because I'm not sure how many people in the audience will be familiar with the work of this group. So here's a brief excerpt from the group's charter. But what I wanted to call out is there are actually 4 main areas within the Technical Specification Group's charter. And I just wanted to walk through each of those in my slides. So there's crawling and harvesting, content indexing, change notifications, and import to viewers. So next. The main focus of the work of the group has really been on crawling and harvesting so far. And the objective of this is to facilitate aggregation of IIIF resources by IIIF aware consumers. So this is not about how to get Google to find all your IIIF stuff. It's about how to get other institutions and entities that are aware of IIIF, give them a means of aggregating your IIIF content, finding your manifests and collections, essentially. The TSG is developing the Change Discovery API, which is based on the W3C Activity Streams 2.0 specification. So this API will specify how to publish activities such as create, update, and delete for individual IIIF resources. At the right, you can see a sample activity stream page, but certainly reference the specification that's being developed to find out more. Next. So the good news about this specification is that it is moving to a new release with the approval of the technical review committee. The version number of this release will be 0.9, and so that indicates it's a beta release. We're getting close to a final version. And I just wanted to call out, we have another slide here with the technical review committee and the thumbs up votes. I just wanted to really call that out. This has been, I guess, our first full year of conference to conference with the TRC active, and I really wanted to thank them for their review and participation and feedback in all of the releases and the issues that we've brought to them. It's been great, and I think this process has worked really well. So Glenn tallied the votes, I think yesterday or this morning, and this 0.9 release has been approved, and we have I think. Simeon's been working on some last-minute merges, and I think we have the green button ready to press to merge this to master and get this out on the site. Not sure quite when we're going to do that today, but it will happen. Next. So changes. So we're jumping from 0.4 to 0.9 because of the moving to this beta status. The changes in this 0.9 release are a couple of new activities to support aggregators, and also a more detailed or expanded processing algorithm section to talk about consuming multiple change discovery API streams. So this really gets to, if you're an aggregator and you're consuming streams from different institutions, and then you're republishing a curated stream, what does that look like? And these new activities help support that along with the processing description. Next. So 0.9 means we're at beta. So that starts to raise the question of, do we have enough implementation experience to kind of move to 1.0 and a final release? There have been a number of implementations, experimental implementations. I'll just point to OCLC Research has a activity stream feed for something like more than 12 million items. Is very large, scale, good test there. Intronda is a company that produces digitization software and digital library software. They've implemented it in their products, which is great. And Glenn told me that the Bodleian has recently announced or submitted a stream to the TSG for review. So what are we looking forward to? The TSG hopes for further implementations and feedback prior to 1.0. Always good to see more implementation. And Glenn, or IIIF, which is working on a central registry of change discovery API streams. So before you can harvest these streams from different institutions, you need to know that they exist and where to find the endpoints. And so the registry will solve that sort of bootstrapping problem of how do you get started aggregating content from the providing institutions. Next. Great. So that was the first element of their charge, as I said, where most of the focus has been for the TSG. Content indexing was the second element. And this is an interesting area because obviously once you aggregate the content, you'd like potentially to try to see whether there's any descriptive metadata for those resources. In the IIIF manifest, you can link to external structured metadata files. So there was originally some thought about reviewing community recommendations around descriptive metadata. That really didn't seem to be a technical concern so much as a community best practice concern. And so a new group has formed, and it's called Discovery for Humans. And so this group is looking at basically what happens when you do try to bring these resources together. How do you present them to humans and let them, search, browse, and find what they're looking for? That group had its first in-person meeting in Ann Arbor in the fall of last year. So that group has started its work. So I think this element of the charge has kind of moved off into that community group, and I'm not aware of any plans really to address this within the context of the TSG. Next slide, please. The third area of their charge is change notification. And there was some discussion of this, I think, early on, and really it's been on the back burner compared to the aggregation harvesting work. And there was discussion during the roadmap session at the Ann Arbor meeting. And when it came to prioritization, the top priorities were sort of finishing up the change discovery API and then moving on to the import to viewers work, which is the next slide, please. So for import to viewers, there is a content state API being developed. It's currently at version 2. This API uses W3C web annotations to encapsulate content state. And the idea here is that you could, for example, encapsulate the state of your viewer. Imagine you're a universal viewer, you're looking at a manifest, you've zoomed in on a particular canvas, but now you want to take that state and convey it to another tool. Perhaps you want to take that and then move it to Mirador so you can do some side-by-side comparison. This specification is getting at how you would encode that state. And the idea is that it would, right now, is that you'll use web annotations with a special motivation of content state, like you see here in the little snippet on the screen. So that work is ongoing. Currently at version 0.2, there have been minor changes over the past year. And I think really it's like their community is looking for, or TSG is looking for community feedback, implementation experience, and so forth. So that's ongoing work and probably the next area of focus after the change discovery API reaches 1.0. That's all. Thank you.
So just share the results to the Cookbook poll. And if you are interested in help, please have a look at the Cookbook channel on the Triplife Slack. So, thanks.
Tom, do you want to share, or do you want to say next?
I think I'll try sharing.
Okay, let me unshare then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, which screen do I want? This one. Okay, so let's bring this across here. Can you see a slide deck, or can you just see a random bit of desktop?
See the slides.
Okay, all right, let me find
looks
it.
good.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we do next now that we've released the image and presentation APIs version 3 and discovery process is coming along. So yeah, we need to work on other specs like Searchin Auth. Some of that is because we now have new version of the presentation API, and the search spec in particular kind of looks a bit old next to it because it uses open annotation to talk about the things in manifest rather than the web annotation data model. Some of these changes are because people have been coming up with all sorts of exciting new use cases or raising issues with existing specs. And some of it is driven by external factors in the way browsers work, which I'll get onto in a bit. But let's start with a poll because that's what we're doing. So the poll here is, have you implemented or considered implementing the Search 1.0 specification? So I'm gonna tick yes to mine because I have. So I'll let you vote on that. Yeah, so as I said, the content search specification is not broken. You could still use it, but it just doesn't look very good if the search results use a different language from the things they're pointing at. So one early proposal was that we just do a kind of quick fix, which probably wouldn't require the formation of a technical specification group. We take the existing functionality and we just make a version that uses the model and serialization of presentation 3. We had, so that would be one option. The other option would be to actually form a technical specification group and work on the issues that are tagged search on IIIF issues. And those are things like the ability to specify spatial or temporal bounds to the search. So that, I want to search this video, the transcriptions of this video from minute 10 to minute 20, for example, or just to include some AV kind of examples in the spec itself, because it's completely image-based at the moment. Specifying granularity of results that you might want. Yeah, there's quite a few issues. And in particular, the newspapers group is very interested in more sort of complex search use cases. So those kind of activities would require the formation of a group. And then there's the kind of overlap search plus auth scenarios, for example, where you want to search something, but the text that you're searching maybe is behind some sort of authentication layer. And this kind of extends to the general protection of data resources like annotations and how the auth spec deals with them. So there begins to be a bit of overlap and potential joint efforts in working groups on these two specs. So results, Glenn, do you want to? Oh, that's pretty good actually. Nearly half of you have either implemented or considered implementing Search 1.0. Cool. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next one. So yeah, just to clarify that, when this came up before, the last time we had a sort of road mapping session at the working group meeting in November, the kind of consensus, although it wasn't a strong consensus, the consensus was to not do the quick fix, but to form a working group and work on these search features. But I just want to kind of go into some of the auth concerns and see whether that's still the consensus. So I'm going to have another poll now. Have you implemented or considered implementing the IIIF auth specification? Okay, while you're doing that. So in previous kind of consideration of what we do next on auth, the biggest thing was basically extending the pattern that auth provides to all web resources rather than just image services, which is in theory all it works on at the moment, because we need to access things that don't have JSON descriptions like image services, but are just web resources like an MP3 file or a video file. So yeah, we need a pattern that works for that, and we need to consider that scenario of auth access to annotations and other kinds of content. And there's been quite a lot of work on this. I think it was first brought up in Toronto, so it's quite a while ago. The concept of a probe service, which now has a fully working implementation in the Universal Viewer, and the British Library have implemented a backend for it to provide a mechanism to extend the general pattern of the current auth spec to all web resources. And a TSG could start by looking at that. But there's another issue which we need to consider with auth, and that is about the use of third-party cookies on the web. I'm just going to take a step back to put this into context. So the IIIF auth spec isn't an auth protocol like things like CAS or OAuth or other kind of different types of auth protocols, because we didn't want to invent another one to add to the many that you can already choose from. We didn't want to force people to switch their institutional access control to a special IIIF version. But it is a protocol. It's a protocol that reveals to clients like Mirrored or the Universal Viewer the state of your access with respect to particular content resources. So it's a way of JavaScript code or some other client finding out whether you can see something. And the purpose of that is to produce a good user experience, so you don't see broken images. And if you are about to see broken images, to send you to somewhere where you can authenticate so you can get some credentials to look at those images. Crucially, the client doesn't really know how the auth works, in the sense that the auth that's protecting the actual content works. The client just needs to understand this interaction pattern for getting that information. Now, for our IIIF use cases, that kind of auth interoperability is all about third-party contexts. And that's where, I'll just skip to the next slide. So if you imagine you have a web page and it has a couple of images on it, and those images aren't at the location that's in your browser's address bar. Now, without auth, that's fine. You can have images linked to on the page from many different locations. But if they are authed, and that auth is implemented with a cookie, then your browser needs to send your cookies for those other sites off, even though you're looking at a different site. And that used to be fine. That's just the way the web works. But increasingly, the fact that that same mechanism is used to do tracking means that browsers have more and more kind of finesse over exactly what you're allowed to do there. So for example, recently, or over the last couple of years, the same site attribute on cookies was introduced, which allows publishers to specify whether or not the browser should send this cookie anywhere off willy-nilly, or whether it should, whether it is actually allowed to send it anywhere other than the origin. And so if you're a publisher providing IIIF resources that you might want people to consume in Mirador behind access control on a different site, you'd set same site equals none, which means there is no control. But if you're a bank, you wouldn't do that, because there is the potential of cross-site request forgery. But what's happened kind of more recently is that basically the web is going to do away with third-party cookies altogether. So Safari 13 blocks third-party cookies. Chrome will do that soon. And this is to prevent nasty privacy invasions. But unfortunately, it's how how interoperability is going to work for auth resources on a web page, especially when a client isn't necessarily known to the publisher of the resources. So I fire up a Mirador instance on my site, and I start looking at things from the British Library. The British Library shouldn't have to know that it shouldn't have to know about my site beforehand. That's going to be a bit of a mess. So the makers of web browsers don't want to kill the advertising model on the web, so they're going to go a different route. And so Chromium has, I won't read this out. You can have a look at these slides. I've put lots of links in them. Chromium is going to introduce this thing called a privacy sandbox. And that's supposed to get around the problem. There's some links here which you can follow. But basically all this kind of effort is based around advertising. So the kind of 3 bullet points I have here, we have this idea where, well, tracking is done with third-party cookies. So we need to work out how to meet the targeted advertising use case so we can get rid of third-party cookies. That's great, but it's how our auth interop works. So we've tried to engage a little bit, and there's an issue there on the web, on the WTC web advertising group, but we haven't had any response to that. So we need to do some more work on just establishing what this landscape is before we can really move forward with auth, because it might turn out that having a more formal standards-based way of granting kind of third-party permissions and allowing interoperability to happen might actually be really good for us and make the auth spec simpler and cleaner. But if it's not going to work that way, then we're going to have to come up with another way of doing it, and that way might be a kind of an actual formal auth protocol, which is what we set out to avoid doing in the first place. So we need to do some more work to understand this. Let's just show. So, well, quite a few of you have at least considered and some implemented the auth spec. So this is clearly something that needs, we need to focus our attention on. That was a kind of lightning trawl through some of the issues we might be facing. And I'm just going to sort of raise another poll, and ideally have sort of more time to digest some of this. But this, we have a kind of next step sort of considerations here. Should we just do the search thing because it's a kind of known problem, and we can do a quick we can form a search TSG to look at search? Should we focus all our efforts on investigating the sort of auth landscape and coming up with a way forward? Should we do that quick search update, which doesn't require a formal group, while we do the investigation of the auth landscape? And then after we've done those things, and we do presumably find a way forward, should the working group should the tech spec group for search and auth be the same group so we can consider use cases together, or are they separate groups? That's a bit of a complex poll, and I hope the offers are multiple, so you can choose more than one. Yeah, you can. So, and again, this isn't a kind of this decision. It's just to gather some sort of feeling in the virtual room for which way we should go with this. I don't know if you can see me clicking that, or is on the shared screen. Is that? No, good. That's not going to influence the voting. Okay, I'll just leave it a few seconds, and I guess we could go to the results. Can you see how many people have voted, Glenn, or should I hang on?
Yeah, it's about 54. We've been getting about 80, so
Okay.
maybe
Let's just leave another
few more.
10 or 20 seconds. Yeah, there's a link. Well, I'm assuming there's a link to those slides somewhere, because I put quite a lot of text in them so that people could digest it a bit later and follow some of the links. I appreciate it's quite a lot to digest there.
Then Sarah asked a question. She apparently saw only one question on the last poll. I don't know whether it's working for everyone.
I definitely saw 5.
As did I.
Yeah.
Yeah, there should be the questions that Tom had on the previous slide.
Well, maybe we should just move to results with the understanding that perhaps not everyone was able to answer things.
Okay, here we go.
That's not super conclusive. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to form an instant conclusion based on that result. I think we'll have to have a look at it. But we should continue the conversation in Slack and elsewhere. I think I'll hand over now. Is it John next?
It is John next.
All right. Well,
I think maybe we can just unshare the slides.
Yeah.
So I think from here we can just switch to questions and answers. There have been some. Rob is in the session in spirit and has been answering some questions as they come up in the Q&A. Let's see. There were questions about the voting, or about the polls. I guess the thing to do here, why don't we keep on with questions in the Q&A for now, and I'll just read them out and we can sort of answer them as they come up. So does the work on change notifications include notification of external IIIF resources? For example, following the work done by Jeffrey a few years ago with linked data notifications, I produce ranges and annotation lists. I would like to notify the source repository of their existence and allow it to pull in these IIIF resources. So essentially it's change notification in scope.
And Rob is answering in chat. It was deferred to post 1.0 at the Michigan meeting. So that's my understanding of it, is that change notifications are in scope, but are a complex topic, and we have 2 other specifications on the go. So these are it's likely to be just sort of pushed back a bit.
Brian Haberberger points out in the Q&A as well that having Canvas URIs resolve is key, and I believe we do recommend, if not require, I forget now where we landed, but that's been a topic of discussion anyway, making sure Canvas URIs do resolve and aren't just simply identifiers in order to make that work. And I think that was one of the blocking issues, if I recall, or areas of concern.
Yeah. It's still not required in the spec, but
Okay,
obviously for notifications, it's useful.
Okay, I'm going to review some of the questions that already came up in the Q&A. I should know this. Can everybody see the Q&A, or is it just those of us who are the hosts or the panelists?
I think everybody should be able to see the Q&A.
Okay, so I'll go through some of those, but in the meantime, feel free to add additional questions. So back earlier in the session, Lutz Helm asked about the status of JSON LD 1.1, and do we know when it will leave draft status? To which Rob answered that it's in a proposed recommendation state with the W3C, and unless something unforeseeable happens, that JSON LD 1.1 should be a full technical recommendation in 2 weeks' time. So that to me, by the way, I have to say, just seems crazy, because when we started talking about using JSON LD, it seemed really far on that horizon. So the fact that we've actually arrived at this horizon somewhat close to the same time, wow, a lot of time has passed. Jeffrey Witt asked about cookbooks, and I'm not going to read the whole question, but essentially it was how do you request different versions, different IIIF versions of the same manifest? So that is a version 2 compliant manifest versus a version 3 compliant manifest, and concerns about having the version baked into the URL versus doing something with HTTP headers. And the answer from Rob, I have not read, but I think it's essentially a plea for writing a cookbook, a recipe to do this. Maybe we should open up this goes on for quite a bit. Shall we, Jeffrey, do you want to comment on this a little more, perhaps, if I unmute you? If I can find you?
Okay, you should be able to talk, Jeff.
Hello?
Hi.
Yep, Jeff.
Hi. Yeah, well, it's nothing more than what I wrote there, but it's just that I'm worried about annotations breaking when, I don't know, I think that it's not always clear to people that the URLs function not only as, you know, lookup identifiers, but also as object identifiers. So if we're making annotations, I mean, if the promise of IIIF is making annotations about resources that can be shared, and we're updating the ID for an object every time the spec updates, then that's a real problem. So I know that it's not something you want to put in the spec, but I was wondering if it should be really targeted as maybe not just like a recommendation, but an anti-pattern to that should really be marked and avoided. But I don't know if that's controversial or not.
I'll step out and say that I don't think it's controversial. I think it is something that needs a pattern established. I would think the cookbook platform is the right place to put that recommendation in that pattern, and then as much as any of these other sorts of best practices, they need to be socialized within the community, right? So it's
Yeah,
not really enough to write something up, but I think, you know, bringing it to the list, talking about it with your wider community of practice. I seem to remember this also coming up with the Oxford folks at some point in the last year or so. I think it was Andrew who brought it up, and so, you know, again, I'll step out, necessarily speaking for all of the editors, but say that starting with a documented pattern that works well for your use case and drafting that as a cookbook recipe feels like the right next step to me.
Yeah, that's fine. I just think that like I think the idea of a socialization the right idea. I feel like I already see socialization trends in the other direction. Like I already see v3 in URLs, and partly because I think it's much easier to implement that than to change the link header. Likewise, it's much easier if you're just navigating manifest via the browser. It's not clear how to, if you want to see the version 3 one, it's not clear how to see that when all you have really control over is changing the URL in your browser. So if people don't know how to change your request header for a browser request, it's hard to show your different versions. So there's a lot of forces that are pushing one to just change the URL, and I think that causes problems.
So Jeffrey, again, speaking for myself and not the editors necessarily, but I see this being, you know, kind of like the pure approach to content negotiation versus the poor man's version of content negotiation, where you use file-like extensions, and it's probably not a matter of doing one or the other, but doing both. So if I want to cheaply address a known version of a manifest without reading HTTP headers and following redirects, etc., if I know or can guess the v3 version of a URI of a manifest, just by building the right string, which is also its own kind of anti-pattern, I realize.
Yeah, but now I've got 3 IDs, and I'm not sure which one to target when I make an annotation.
Well, you've got 3 IDs, or you've got some good redirects, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
I mean,
yeah, that's fine.
Are there new questions?
So just on that cookbook, Tom has found an issue in the cookbook recipes about this version 2, version 3 crossover, and I think we discussed in Ann Arbor, and it does sound a really good recipe. Feel free to take it on, Jeff, if you'd be up for it.
I want to copy someone else's solution. I didn't want to.
Okay.
Maybe this might be a good subject to organize some people to speak to their implementations on a technical community call, you know, one Wednesday, and kind of start to socialize the best practices through that.
Yeah, Cookbook Issue 57 is waiting for that best practice.
We have a new question, essentially asking for the best resource for simple descriptions, even diagrams of what the various APIs are beyond image and presentation, basically for getting a quick understanding of the scope. Do we have a good scoping document on the website? We don't really. So there's certainly triplife.io/API, which at least lists them. I think that's the correct page. But it's a really good point. A diagram or a listing of how these pieces fit together. We kind of use puzzle pieces when we present them, but that doesn't really get to the technical scope or intersections of the different specs. So that probably is something we could perhaps do a better job communicating.
Would you say, maybe this is one for Josh, that this is actually one of the tasks around the website update is to convey that message that there's this whole family of specs that do quite different things, and this is how they can all work together?
Yes, I think that's one piece of it, but I also think there's this kind of hand-holding probably needs to occur in a couple of different places. So yeah, and we always need help kind of making this digestible.
And I had the URL wrong. It's triplife.io/technical-details. That lists all the, I believe both stable, I'm not going to go there now, stable and draft APIs.
Yeah, the technical detail one just as the kind of the main version. So if you go there now, it'll show 3.0 from an hour ago, which is fantastic. and also link to the draft content state and change discovery. But there's some text at the bottom there, which Jason Ronaldo wrote for us, which kind of gives you an intro of the different APIs and helps you think about which ones to implement and how they fit together. It's not quite the diagram you were after, and I agree we could do more, but that's probably a good place to start.
Okay, let's see. Stefano, actually, so this is kind of one for you, maybe, Tom, since you were presenting and seemed to have a slight opinion. Stefano is asking about the search plus auth technical steering group solution. As he's saying, it seems appealing, but maybe he needs more information about how the two research paths, that is around search versus auth, would influence each other.
Yeah, I think there's two things to consider, because I think the most of the search work is like the work of the other technical specification groups, in that it's about turning use cases into spec using tools that we are, understand well, like the web and JSON LD and the presentation model and so on. Whereas the kind of research or discovery or whatever you want to call it work required to find a way forward for auth or come up with the best way forward is much more well, much less clear to me. It needs some research. It needs some engagement with browser vendors. It needs some it needs as wide a discussion as possible, as wide a consideration of our strange third-party cookie use cases in browsers. So I think the reason to have a combined TSG is for those cases where you need to consider how auth works for search results. But there's probably quite a bit of independent work that could be done on search a lot easier than auth. So yeah, I don't know the right answer to this. I think there's probably a kind of initial bit of work to do on auth that doesn't really have anything to do with search, just kind of establishes the technical landscape that they can work in. But I think there is quite a bit of stuff that could happen on a combined search auth TSG to just make sure that they work really nicely together. I don't know if that really helps. My thinking isn't very clear on this yet.
Are there other questions that I haven't answered? I think I've covered everything that's in the chat. And I'm not seeing anything else. Is there anything anybody else would like to ask? If not, I'm going to propose we do a, we didn't quite dare merge the, and push live the 3.0 image and presentation API specifications in real time, as fun and ceremonious as that might have been. So I think what I'll do instead, I think we can pretty safely, without breaking anything, merge the Discovery 5 to Discovery 9 PR. Do editors agree that that's relatively low risk? Okay, so
0.4 to 0.9.
Sorry?
0.4 to 0.9.
You're right, sorry. So I'm going to share my screen, and I only have a gazillion browser windows open, so one moment. And maybe you can see my screen now. Do you see GitHub?
We can.
Okay, so it's Rob's pull request, which is why you don't see Rob, just a little process insight here, you don't see Rob listed in the list of approvers here. But all the editors plus Glenn have approved, so we are going to squash and merge. And there we are. Woohoo! Hope that was as exciting for everyone else as it was for me. I can hear you, I can feel you all applauding. that might be it for this session then, unless there's anything else anybody has to add. Okay. In that case, Josh, do you have anything to tag on the end, or can I close this up?
No, just thanks, and we're doing the community road mapping session next.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Take
Bye,
care.
everyone.
Cool.
Woohoo! Discovery!